Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who joined us today to this URBIS webinar. You have my warm welcome. My name is Luisa Weiss. I work for the Beatley Capacity Center, and I will be facilitating this webinar from the technical side. This is why I want to quickly make you familiar with the way we use the system that you have logged onto. For the duration of the presentations that will be given, you will be muted, so you're in listen-only mode. However, we warmly welcome your questions and suggestions to the presentations, and we ask you to do so by typing your questions in the question box that you see in front of you in the GoToWebinar panel. In the end, we will have a question and answer session, and we will get back to you and to your questions and suggestions. Also, if you experience technical difficulties, please type in the question box and I'm happy to help you as far as I can. Please enjoy this URBIS dialogue with us. I'm handing over to David Maddox, who will be facilitating today.
Welcome everyone to the URBIS Dialogues. My name is David Maddox from the Nature of Cities. The URBIS Dialogues, this is number 10. The URBIS Dialogues is a webinar series designed to address urban challenges, and share experiences, and connect changemakers in our urban biosphere. Today, our title is Biophilic Design, Incorporating Nature into Design. The URBIS partnership is the Urban Biosphere and Design. You can see the advisory board across the top and a series of our partners. The URBIS is the Secretariat, is hosted by Beatley Biodiversity Center in Cape Town. The URBIS Dialogues are a 15-webinar, a global platform for online dialogue. We hold it every first or second Thursday in the month, and then are archived for repeated viewing. They bring together representatives from cities and local governments and experts from around the world to share their experiences and address specific urban challenges focusing on sustainable use of biodiversity, ecosystem services, and the connection of cities to their supported regions around the cities. The next webinar will be next month, hosted by Pawlyn. You can see it on the left of your screen. Today's webinar, Biophilic Design, Incorporating Nature into Design. We have three speakers, Tim Beatley, Mike Wells, and Michael Pawlyn. First up is Tim Beatley. Tim is the Teresa Heinz Professor of Sustainable Communities in the Department of Urban and Environmental Planning at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia, where he has taught for the last 25 years. Much of Beatley's work focuses on creative strategies by which cities and towns can fundamentally reduce their ecological footprints, while at the same time becoming more livable and equitable places. He is the author and co-author of more than 15 books, including Green Urbanism, Native to Nowhere, Ethical Land Use, and his most recent book, Biophilic Cities. He holds a PhD in City and Regional Planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Please welcome Tim Beatley.
Hey, great, let's see. Show my screen. Okay, I'll pull my slides up and very good. Can you see that? I'm hoping you can. Thank you, David, for the introduction. And hello, everybody, and good morning or good afternoon or whatever it is where you happen to be. In the time that I have, I'm going to just talk a bit about this concept of biophilic cities. That connecting the word biophilia and cities has been an important mission of ours in recent months. As David mentioned, I'm an urban planner, a city planner, and so I'm thinking a lot about what makes for a sustainable and resilient city. Many of us advocate for compact, dense cities, that's what will be necessary to reduce carbon emissions and create livable conditions and so on. But compactness and density raise some challenges for us, because the other part of this is that we argue that we need nature. We're an increasingly urbanized planet, and we need to imagine cities that have nature in them, around them. The cities, in fact, are embedded in natural systems. So this is the challenge for us, I think, cities and nature together. So starting with the concept of biophilia, I have to give a lot of credit to E.O. Wilson, Ed Wilson at Harvard. He wasn't the first to use this term, but he's really the one who's popularized it in the way that we know it today. So here's one of his definitions on the screen: biophilia, the innately emotional affiliation of human beings to other living organisms. Innate means hereditary and hence part of ultimate human nature. So this idea that nature is not something optional. It's absolutely essential. It's essential for leading a happy, productive, meaningful life. And we have co-evolved with the natural world. So we're carrying with us our ancient brains, and not surprising that we are happiest and healthiest in close connection with nature. Excuse me. So about 5 years ago, we started something called the Biophilic Cities Project at the University of Virginia, UEA. And we started with some funding from the Summit Foundation in Washington. Here's another quote from E.O. Wilson, by the way: human species is grown up in nature. And so we started this project with the goal of trying to understand the different ways that nature might be incorporated in cities, the different ways that we might imagine what a biophilic city is. We enlisted the help of 10 partner cities around the U.S. and around the country, around the globe. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what some of those cities are doing. And then about 2 years ago, we launched a global biophilic cities network. So we're imagining a network of cities around that will help, will serve as a peer group to share information, to help each other, to imagine their cities to be more natureful. This image, by the way, is just a screenshot of our new webpage. We have a new Biophilic Cities logo. I encourage everybody to go look. It's biophilic.cities.org. And a lot of information there, actually one grid on the screen now has a lot of, gives you a sense of what we're interested in and the different things we're working on, and just surfing around would be a good thing to do. And there's also a map that shows where our members are, member cities, and you can also join the network as an individual or a group just by signing an online pledge. So we're in a mode at the moment of trying to expand this global network and trying to get more cities interested in being involved in this initiative. And we have a protocol, in fact, for joining the network that's on the webpage. We're getting a lot of traction. This is an image from the current issue of ARC News, Esri's magazine. Getting a lot of traction behind this idea of biophilic cities and cities in nature, compact cities, dense cities in nature together. The idea is picking up steam, we believe. Some images from the UK, Birmingham. Birmingham in the UK has been one of our 10 partner cities, and about 2 years ago, they announced that they intended to be the first biophilic city in the UK. We got a nice story in The Guardian. They're continuing to kind of move forward and exploring what it means to be a biophilic city. A lot of what we have been doing is sharing information and collecting and telling the stories of these fantastic emerging biophilic cities. And this is an image from a school in Singapore. And so we have a 45-minute film that we've made about Singapore. It's on YouTube, and you can just Google Singapore Biophilic City, and you'll find the whole thing. We've made films about Wellington, New Zealand, another of our partner cities, and other places. And so trying to tell these stories in visually interesting ways and finding creative ways to tell what cities are up to. So we're imagining this network of biophilic cities as a intercity network, a network of cities, but we're also finding that there's a lot of interest within particular cities to come together, for individuals and groups to come together around the notion of biophilia. And these are images actually from our first meeting of a group called Biophilic DC in Washington, DC. And we've got similar groups that are forming in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. There's a new group in Philadelphia called Biophilic And it's really a way to bring an umbrella, to bring groups together to support, to work on greening and rewilding and incorporating nature in these cities. So Washington is an interesting case. They've really just started, but this group has managed to get the Washington, D.C. City Council to have adopted a Biophilic Cities resolution, which is pretty impressive, and they've just submitted their application to join the network. So a lot is happening around the U.S. and around the world. So just to talk a little bit about, why this connection to nature? Why are we promoting this idea of biophilia in cities? And there are lots of reasons. There has been this amazing flood of recent research in the last 5 to 10 years showing just the incredible physical and mental health benefits of nature. We know long-term chronic stress is a huge issue for urbanites. Nature is not the only thing that helps us there, but it seems to have a unique impact. A lot of studies that show that we are calmer, where our mood changes when we're in nature, that our outlook changes, that stress is reduced in many ways, we're happier. Nature also creates the conditions for social contacts, and we know a lot of evidence coming out of health that the more friends we have, the deeper, more extensive our social contacts are, the healthier we will be. So nature is not the only thing that brings us together, that helps us form friendships and social contact, but it seems uniquely suited. We have a lot of evidence now that that in the presence of nature, we're more likely to be creative. Interesting evidence coming out of psychology that we're more likely to be generous. We're more likely to think longer term. We're more likely to be cooperative in the presence of nature. Not, to me, a big surprise, again, given how we co-evolve with the natural world. I'm often talking about the importance of wonder and awe in our lives. And those things are so important, give such meaning to our lives. And cities ought to be understood as places where we maximize moments of awe, where we look for awe-inspiring aspects and dimensions, and nature is uniquely suited. And then finally, we're spending a lot of time these days talking about resilience and resilient cities. And we would argue that biophilic cities are almost by definition resilient cities. Almost everything that you can do to make a city more natureful will make it more resilient, whether that means installing green rooftops and planting trees that will help cool that city, or addressing stormwater management, or all the other things that might help a city become more resilient in the face of things like climate change, for example. So don't have time to go into much of the evidence, but there is a lot of it, and it's coming to very similar conclusions. Just one slide about the Japanese research around forest bathing. I love this concept of forest bathing, that you would be walking through a forest with the sights and sounds, the dappled light, the beauty of a forest, and not a surprise that they're finding that at the end of that walk, your stress hormone levels or cortisol levels go down. That walk boosts your immune system. The Japanese are so convinced about this that they've established a network of forest bathing, forest therapy stations in cities around the country. So what do we mean by this concept of biophilic cities, and how might we express that? How can we articulate that? So there are different ways of doing it. We could do it in a narrative sense, and here's one effort. This is essentially the pledge that we have online. Biophilic cities are cities that place nature at the heart of their design and planning, cities that actively protect, restore, celebrate nature, biodiversity, and wildness, cities that recognize the profound power that nature has to make us healthier, happier, and to lead more meaningful lives, and cities that seek to foster deep connections to the natural world. So connectedness, connections to nature, fostering connections, a big part of this. For us, we're trying to push the envelope a bit and trying to kind of imagine an even deeper sense in which cities could be biophilic. Imagining that cities could be places that immerse us in nature, surround us in nature. So city in a garden, city in a park, city in a forest. One of our partner cities, Singapore, has recently changed their motto from Singapore, a garden city, to Singapore, a city in a garden, which seems like a small change, but it's actually quite a significant difference. So imagining that we don't need to, in the city, we don't necessarily need to walk to that park. Why don't we imagine that we're living in the park, or why don't we imagine we're living in the forest? And in Singapore, They've done a remarkable number of things, including a landscape replacement policy that requires any building in that city to incorporate nature. This is the Park Royal Hotel, which is a pretty amazing living building with incredible sky gardens and nature all around, and actually contributing to nature from the perspective of someone walking by it. And so Singapore may be our best example of a city that's coming close to this immersive vision of a city. Another example would be Melbourne, a very impressive forest plan that they've just adopted. They're aspiring to doubling their tree forest canopy by 2040, and they don't want to just talk about trees, planting trees in the city. They want to imagine a city in a forest. And that's really what a biophilic city is about. They've done some really creative things to engage the public. One of my favorite things, and you may have heard of this because it got a lot of attention in the media, they've given each tree in the city of Melbourne its own unique ID and its own, and they have a master GIS database, and they've also given each tree an email address and encouraged everyone to send an email to their favorite tree. Here's one. Yvonne Lynch, who's headed this program, has been collecting these emails, and here's one from someone named Alicia. I see you every morning, watch you change with the seasons. It makes me happy knowing you're there. Biophilia, the love of nature, I think we need to actually find more creative ways of expressing that love, demonstrating that love in cities. So our notion of biophilic cities are cities that actually judge progress maybe in some different ways. And here are two sets of images on the right. Wellington, New Zealand, they have a terrific story of a protected area in the middle of the city called Zealandia, where they erected a predator-proof fence, and they're trying to bring back the parrots and native species. And their tagline is bringing birdsong back to Wellington. So this idea of judging progress in a city by the number of people, the neighborhoods that actually hear native birdsong. And it's working in Wellington, in fact. On the left, Mayor Slay, Mayor of St. Louis, and Catherine Warner, the Sustainability Director, holding up materials related to a very interesting program there, milkweeds for monarchs. The mayor has declared that the city will be planting 250 butterfly gardens. Mayors make lots of proclamations, make lots of promises, not often related to butterflies. So a different way maybe of judging the progress of a city. Lots of other things, we could talk about different design qualities of a biophilic city. We would argue that a biophilic city is one that represents a network of green spaces and nature close to this immersive idea. This is an image of Helsinki. The notion that you walk out your door, you have nature all around you, and you can move to progressively larger amounts of nature as you move away and from your home or your office. And so here in Helsinki, in this image, the idea of moving from a dense urban core out to old-growth forests at the edge. Sometimes talk about this as a whole-of-city approach, so it's rooftop or room to region, rooftop to bioregion, and all of the scales in between. Nature needs to be thought about at every level, of course. We've had an active, ongoing discussion about what constitutes nature. Nature, of course, is a culturally defined term to a certain degree. And in the biophilic community, we may hear more about this with the other speakers, there is of course, a belief in the importance of materials, building materials, and shapes and forms from nature. The image on the upper left is from a guy named Marc Granion, who's a Spanish designer and artist, and he's developed a system for installing green rooftops on the roofs of buses, and there are a couple of cities in Spain that have buses like this running around. Is that nature? Well, it's one aspect of nature, and so we have this broad notion of what nature is. It's not always just living nature, but lots of other ways that biophilia, that we can connect with nature. I'm quickly running out of time. I want to make the point that a biophilic city is not just a city that has a lot of nature. It's not just the presence or absence of nature. It's how we connect with that nature. It's the human engagement of that nature. How much do we care about that nature? Do we recognize common species of flora and fauna? Are we engaged in restoring nature? Are we outside? What portion of our day is spent enjoying nature? So it's the engagement as well. as the amount of nature. We've been pondering this question, others have as well. Is there something like a minimum daily requirement of nature? We think there is. We're not sure what it is. In our Biophilic Cities network and our project, we are conceptualizing this recently through this concept of a nature pyramid, kind of similar to the food pyramid that we've been using as a way of guiding a healthy diet. So the things at the top of that food pyramid are things that you would eat, but not in large quantities. You want to build your diet based on the fruits and vegetables and things at the bottom of that pyramid. Similarly with nature, what is the urban nature, the healthy urban nature diet? And it's we may go off and have an immersive experience in some faraway rainforest, but the carbon footprint associated with that means that we can't afford that for everyone to do that. We've got to think about the nature diet in the neighborhood, the everyday nature, the nature around us where we live and work. And this is an image, actually. Singapore liked this idea of our nature pyramid, so they developed their own version of it using things that had meaning for them. So we're imagining maybe that every city in our network could have their own version of the nature pyramid. Okay, I'm fast running out of time. The last few slides I have before I stop, just a little sampling of what some of the cities in our network are up to and the ways they're imagining cities. This is Luis Arribe from Vitoria-Gasteiz, the capital of the Basque Country, and behind him you see their vision. They've developed this remarkable green ring, now imagining an interior green ring, bringing nature through the dense city, and one of their first projects is to daylight a stream corridor. Oslo, 2/3 of this city is in protected forest, and they're developed a plan to bring back to the surface and restore the 8 major rivers of that city and a really remarkable urban trail network as well. San Francisco has been one of our partner cities from the beginning. Many of you know about their efforts to create parklets. This is one parklet in that city. It's the first residential parklet designed by Jane Martin, who you see here. It's taking 2 or 3 on-street parking spaces and converting them to parks. And this one is a very green one and includes even a vegetative dinosaur, affectionately known as Trixie, which Jane is touching here. Singapore, I've mentioned, a remarkable story in many levels, a city that's grown in population, but at the same time, its percentage of green cover is actually increased. And they have a remarkable park connectors network that takes people to nature. Nature's really all around in that city, but a landscape replacement policy, lots of other things that they're doing. Every hospital, every health facility that they're building now puts nature at the center. This is a hospital called KTPH. It's in the film about Singapore. If you watch that film, there's a beautiful case study and story about this remarkable hospital. And their measure of success is healing, to be sure, but it's also the numbers of species of birds and butterflies that they see on the site. And they have a running tally of those on one of the walls on one of the buildings. It even has a working farm on the rooftop of one of the buildings that includes, among other things, 140 fruit trees. Really quite remarkable. So the last point I'll make, and I'll stop, is that back to the point about cities of awe, I've been especially interested recently in marine cities, coastal cities, cities on the edge of water environments and aquatic and marine habitats. And basically making the point, this is a new book called Blue Urbanism, that we need to think about nature, sometimes the nature we can't see, the remarkable nature that's not very far away, but it might actually be underwater. And this idea that cities can be connected to water and oceans, this concept of blue urbanism. And we're finding this emerging as an important issue in several of our partner cities. This is an image from Wellington where they are moving forward. They have an impressive network of green belts, but they're now developing a vision for blue belts. So an integrated aquatic, marine, and terrestrial network of nature and green spaces. This is a guy named Steve Journet, who's is actually diving in the Wellington Harbor, dives almost every day, but beginning to understand those marine spaces as natureful spaces and spaces that we want to connect urbanites to. Okay, I've run out of time. Love it if you could visit our website. We do webinars as well. We have an e-newsletter. Very soon going to be a magazine. We have videos online, lots of materials, and we'd love any ideas that you have out there about cities, perhaps the city you live in, that might be interested in joining the network. So with that, I will stop. Thank you so much for listening.
Many thanks, Tim. That is wonderful. Next up is Michael Pawlyn. Michael Pawlyn has been described as a pioneer of biomimicry and established the exploration architecture in 2007 to focus exclusively on this emerging discipline. In 2008, the company was shortlisted for the Young Architect of the Year award in the internationally renowned Buckminster Fuller Challenge. He jointly initiated the Sahara Forest Project and is a founding partner of Sahara Forest Project AS, a company established to deliver concrete initiatives for restorative growth. Prior to setting up exploration, Michael Pawlyn worked with Grimshaw for 10 years and was central to the team that radically reinvented horticulture architecture for the Eden Project. He was responsible for leading the design of the warm, temperate, and humid tropics biomes, and the sub that included proposals for a third biome for plants from dry tropical regions. He has lectured widely on the subject of sustainable innovation and in 2011 became one of only a handful of architects to have a talk posted on TED.com. His TED Talk has since had over 1 million viewings. In the same year, his book Biomimicry in Architecture was published by the Royal Institute of British Architects. Exploration is currently working on a range of biomimicry-based architectural projects and a book commissioned by TED. Please welcome Michael Pawlyn.
Hi there. Thanks very much for involving me. Could you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great, great. Well, good to be involved. Thanks for involving me. I'm a big fan of Tim's work. And I'm going to be talking partly about biophilia, but more about biomimicry. So we've worked with both of those principles. And for me, biologically inspired design approaches are really the best way of bringing about the kind of changes that we need to bring about over the next few decades. They could be the most challenging decades that humanity has ever faced, but the prize of a truly ecological city is absolutely visible now, and it's a clear destination to aim for. So let me just say a little bit about what I mean by biomimicry. So these are two contrasting images. On the left, you have glass production as it is conventionally made in human manufacturing. And then on the right, you have the biological equivalent, that is a glass sponge. So we use very high temperatures and sometimes quite high pressures to manufacture our materials very often, whereas biology has evolved to do it at ambient temperature and ambient pressure. So the glass sponge, it actually has optical fibers which are of a higher optical quality than man-made fibers. And that's all made just with available materials at very low energy. Another contrast, concrete construction and coral reefs. Well, we pour something like in billion tons of concrete every year globally. And every ton of concrete releases roughly a ton of carbon dioxide. Now, biology does the opposite. Through the process of biomineralization, it produces hard structures, and for every atom of calcium, it sequesters an atom of carbon. So if we could master the technique of biomineralization and apply that to the concrete industry, then that would have the potential to take billions of tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere rather than the other way around. And this is the biological equivalent of fire detection. So whatever room you're in, you can probably see somewhere a fire detector. And that fire detector has a continuous connection back to a power station burning fossil fuels. It probably has a range of only about 8 meters. And yet this beetle can detect a forest fire at roughly 80 kilometers, so 10,000 times the range. And it doesn't need a continuous connection back to a power station burning fossil fuels. So the key thing is, if we could learn to do things the way that nature has evolved to do them, then we could really start to make radical increases in resource efficiency, doing far more with far less. And here's another example that I like. This is the dog vomit slime mold. So slime molds are single-celled organisms, and they form minimum distance networks between sources of food. In 2009, some scientists at Hokkaido University carried out an experiment with a map of the Tokyo region. And what they did is they put a little source of food on each of the cities surrounding Tokyo. Those are the little white dots. And then they put a slime mold on Tokyo itself. That's the big yellow blob. The slime mold spread out, it located all those sources of food, and then it started optimizing the connections between them. And when it had finished, that layout exactly matched the railway network in that part of Japan. But whereas it had taken the engineers thousands of hours to arrive at that optimization, the slime mold did it in just 26 hours. So if we could learn to do things and solve challenges the way biology has, again, we could start to do things much more efficiently, save energy and resources. So the first project I'm going to talk about is the biomimetic office. And if you're going to incorporate planting into buildings, and as Tim has explained, there's a very good reason for doing that. So if you're going to do that, then you need to design for quite high levels of daylight. And that was one of the primary drivers for this building. We wanted it to be as far as possible naturally lit. And we insisted on having a biologist as part of our design team who helped the design team by identifying biological examples of light harvesting. So this one is the spookfish. It has a mirror-shaped eye which can focus very low levels of bioluminescence coming up from the ocean and focus those onto its retina. Another one we looked at is the stone plant. So this is a plant that lives in deserts, and for reasons of thermal stabilization, most of the plant is below the ground. And that means that the chemical reactions can take place at a very steady temperature, and there's a roof light in the top that allows that light to come down into the plant. Another one we looked at is the brittle star. Now this is a starfish that lives as much as 500 meters below the ocean surface, where light levels are incredibly low. And it's evolved a covering of near optically perfect lenses over its skin. And those are able to detect very small amounts of movement and light, and so it can see predators before they see it. So all of these encouraged us to think much more creatively and deliberately about how we would bring light into the building. A fairly conventional way of designing for daylight in offices is to just look at the right distance between the window walls. And in London, you can find lots of examples of really deep office floors that are maybe 25, 35, sometimes even 40 meters between windows. And you know those are going to be high energy buildings because they'll be artificially lit and air conditioned. And we decided that the right dimension was about 12 meters. So no one was further than 6 meters from the nearest window. And then thinking about what this translated into in terms of a building form, one approach would be to take these narrow floor plates and to stack them up into a tower form. And that would be fine if we were dealing with high land values in a central urban location. We wanted to develop a more universal concept than that. So we looked at two other building forms. One was a ring of offices around the central atrium, and the next one was a more linear approach, so two linear blocks with a linear atrium. And it was the third one that seemed to work best when we analyzed light levels. So using daylight software, when we looked at this in plan, we found we were getting this curved pattern of shading around the middle of each block because of the shading effect of the opposite block. So the next move was to simply bend those floor plates so that we get a very even quality of light all the way along. And this produced two further challenges. Firstly, narrow floor plates aren't great for creative clusters of people. You need some wider areas. And secondly, this wasn't making very efficient use of a rectangular site. And we were probably going to end up with a rectangular site. So then learning lessons of surface area to volume optimization in biology, we elaborated the plan form into this undulating form. So we still had no point that was further than 6 meters from the nearest window, but now we were getting much better facilities for creative clusters of people, and we were making more efficient use of a rectangular site. And still with daylight, we looked at the building in section, and we found it was reasonably easy to get enough light at the top. The challenge was how to get the light further down. So for this, we looked at the possibility of harvesting daylight based on a rainforest plant called Anthurium waraquinum, which has evolved lenses over its leaf surfaces, and somehow those are able to focus diffuse light. So that's become a research project now, and we're hoping that there'll still be time to bring that into the project. What we did conclude is that there was a good case for shaping the building to allow more light in, and we designed a large-scale light reflector in the middle of the atrium that, based on the spookfish, that would bounce light deeper into the lower parts of the building. And then looking at this space underneath, in biology, often structures serve multiple functions. So we decided this would be a great space to turn into a really dramatic meeting space that would add value to the building. So designing for high levels of daylight means that you can incorporate a whole range of plants, and NASA concluded that these ones can deal with nearly all the contaminants in indoor environments. And this is how the scheme looks now. So the form very much driven by daylight. That's the spookfish light reflector in the middle, and that's another view. This is how the atrium would look. So it's flooded with natural light. The engineers involved have predicted that it should be one of the lowest energy buildings in the world when it gets built. Now moving on to another project. This is one we've been working on in India. This is the Zero Waste Factory. And there were a number of things we were trying to do here, using biological approaches to water treatment, biological systems as a way to move towards zero waste, and trying to incorporate really generous amounts of planting on both sides of the factory. So the factory has roof lights throughout, and every part of that factory has views out to nature both sides. And that's radically different to the conventional model for textile factories in India. So the client had already done quite a lot in terms of energy saving. So the main focus we had was on turning the water system into something much closer to a closed loop scheme. This is a fairly conventional approach. This is the approach we're proposing, where most of the water gets treated using biological forms of treatment. There is an approach that gets closer to zero liquid discharge. At the moment, that's looking a lot more expensive. So we're working with the client on trying to reduce that. And then this is the solid waste. So this is a conventional approach, produces a lot of waste materials. And we've found, working with the client, that we're actually able to turn most of those into materials that can be sold for other uses. And we've conceived of the scheme very much as being like an ecosystem. So we have the realm of the factory with the various processes. We have the energy story here and the water strategy here. And the trick here is really to get things to connect up so that the waste from one process becomes the input for something else, and you can move towards being a zero waste, very efficient system. And we managed to design out most of the problematic dyes, and so most of this stuff can be treated with biological forms of treatment, and the water can go back into the process. So that's another view. So all this stuff down the middle here, this is part of the biological water treatment. So we're trying to get dual benefits. It's doing the job of cleaning the water, and it's also serving an amenity or biophilic benefit in that it gives people something nice to look out onto when they're working in the factory. And finally, we've only got 3 minutes left, the Sahara Forest Project. So this is a model for, it's based on a beetle which harvests its own fresh water in the desert, and that turned into a type of greenhouse that is cooled and humidified with seawater. So we can grow crops in arid regions with a fraction of the amount of water of conventional approaches, and it actually allows us to harvest some of that water in the same way as the beetle does. And then we're putting that together with forms of solar energy that have very interesting synergies. And the shade created by those mirrors or solar panels makes it possible to revegetate areas of desert underneath. So this is a sketch of what we're proposing. This is how it would look at large scale. So it's a model for how we could create zero carbon food in some of the most water stressed parts of the planet, as well as generating renewable energy and locking up carbon back in desert soils. And I'm going to skip through now, I'm running short of time. So we We built a version of this. This was opened in 2012 during the climate change talks in Qatar. And apart from all the technical aspects of the project, we also monitored what happened to the biodiversity on site. It was a bare patch of desert to start with. And this diagram shows what happened over the course of the next 8 months in terms of the birds, the mammals, and the insects. So the first things to appear were flies, nothing too interesting there. But the same day as the first plants came to site, we had the first birds appearing, common house sparrows, and we also had the first insects, grasshoppers and crickets. About a month later, we had the first butterfly and more types of bird, wagtails. We had more and more insects. Then we had the first problematic species, rats, and they started multiplying rather quickly. We also had mice. The number of birds was increasing. We had the first dragonfly 3 days after the algae ponds were filled. And then the number of rats started going down when a feral cat appeared. The birds species carried on increasing. This was a fairly rare bird, a hoopoe, which we saw on site. And then when the halophyte plants were planted, we had rufous-tailed shrikes and more wagtails. And then eventually we had the first example of an indigenous mammal. This is called a jerboa. And all that was achieved in just 8 months on a site 100 meters by 100 meters. And I find it very encouraging to see that nature, if you give it the right opportunity to recover, it has an amazing capacity to recover. And that's why I feel these models of regenerative development are really strong ones that will allow us to develop cities for the ecological age and to restore some of the damage that we've done to ecosystems over the last century or so. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you very much. These first two talks we've had really emphasize how expansive the idea of biophilia and biomimicry can be for designing spaces for humans and nature to coexist. We have one more speaker, Mike Wells. Mike is an ecological consultant, ecologist, and eco-urbanist with a global outlook and portfolio. Co-founder of Biodiversity by Design, he is also research fellow in green infrastructure design at the University of Bath School of Architecture and Civil Engineering in the UK. Key interests now lie in finding new opportunities for biodiversity enhancement and for the promotion of sustainable ecosystem goods and services. Mike is an expert in wetland creation, restoration, and management, and is a chartered water and environmental manager and a registered consultant with the UK River Restoration Centre. He has contributed to the ecological design of river and other wetland restorations in urban and rural areas in the UK, mainland Europe, and Southeast Asia. He was lead author of Estuary Edges, the UK Environment Agency's Guide to the Ecological Design of Tidal Rivers, and Ecological Design Advisor in the development of water-sensitive urban design guidance for Singapore. Please welcome Mike Wells.
Hello, good afternoon to everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Just very quickly, I can't resist to say how excited I am to be asked to do this and to share a stage with the two previous speakers who are heroes of mine. I have to say that the image of the glass sponge was one of the first things that got me into biology and zoology. We have a name for it, the Venus's flower basket, and I think that sort of language is the sort of thing that captures imagination and gets people into this whole endeavor. But my talk is really at the sort of coalface of dealing with people who don't get it. It's trying to achieve biophilic design with the development sector, and often in partnership, I believe, best with the planning sector. So it is UK-centric to some extent, but there are examples from elsewhere. I'll just try to go to my next page. So I think the most important thing to do is to realize, or to make people realize, there is a challenge. Most people listening in on this will know what that is, and it has been definitely expressed more and more in many current publications. But the challenge is that biophilia, as pointed out by Stephen Kellett, is actually a weak tendency. And much as we all love what we've seen just now, these tendencies to go towards nature and encourage it are sensibilities that can atrophy, as Stephen puts it, and need nurturing. So that's challenge one.
Mike, can we? Let me interrupt you for a second. We cannot see your presentation. Can you share your screen, please?
Okay, screen sharing. Okay, is that here?
Yes. Now we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. The next problem is that designers that I meet are often not educated to see the value in all the things that have been expressed so far. And these are some of the phrases that you get in project meetings dealing with developers. I'm sure anyone who has dealt with developers and certain recalcitrant planners will come across phrases like this quite regularly. So what does this mean? Is that we are just up against it and we are, as ecologists and environmentalists, in the clear? Well, no, because an awful lot of ecologists I meet are also not particularly centered on urbanism. In fact, some of these quotes here show actually even believe this endeavor could be a bit of a waste of time when we need to restore fully functional ecosystems in the countryside. So there's another challenge. And the other thing we can do when we talk to people and clients and developers is be clear on the urgency of things. Again, most people listening to this won't need convincing that we're an urban species, and if we keep on developing, this is Shanghai, cities without the considerations we've heard about, then we are heading for significant problems coming out of that high-density living without mitigation. Another key sense of urgency is the mass extinction that we seem to be creating on a par with previous mass extinctions in geological time. And the other thing that's been mentioned is that, as Tom Wolfe said in The Bonfire of the Vanities, no one seems to be able to take reality straight anymore. We drug ourselves, we take various types of tranquilizers to get through life, and the urban pathologies are quite rife. That's an image on the left that was from an Ulrich paper, which I'll come back to. So how can we get to where we want to be starting from here? And I believe that the first thing is that the obvious things to us need to be explained to others, such as thing as that there's an urban landscape. Now, what is an urban landscape? Well, this wonderful book on the urban cliff revolution, which I recommend reading, shows how we think that separating buildings and a landscape around it, quite often on projects it's the greening up, the landscaping, but actually that's a false dichotomy. And in fact, we came from almost certainly scree slopes and rocky sides of cliffs and then caves. Nearly all our plants that we eat came from those original ancestral habitats. And it's not at all surprising to be living in high-rise around landscapes. Therefore, the point being of this is that landscape is buildings and structures as well. The idea of urban landscape actually as a term is relatively new, and it's worth reinforcing that, because so often in projects the two are separated. And this quote from the European Landscape Convention makes the next step in this, which is it's not just buildings and landscape, soft estate around them, it's people. Now, that's obvious in a way, but the interactions between them create something which is not either of those things. It's not a physical thing, but a conceptual thing, a psychological thing. And the best I've ever seen this expressed is a very difficult essay. It's worth reading by Felix Guattari, the philosopher from France, who points out in very simple terms, I will try and explain the basic ecology, which is that of the environment, which we all know about. But then there's ecology between all of us, the way we interact. But even more interestingly, an ecology of thoughts, that thoughts themselves have their own ecosystem, that it might not follow the rules of either the others. But what that actually means is that when you're designing, that the smallest biophilic interventions that might seem almost irrelevant are worth considering, because they can impact on one of these ecologies, if not on all of them. So it's definitely worth mentioning that there is every little action can have an ecology of thought impact. And so the next thing we can do is obviously connect the two together, as done on the Nature of Cities website and many other emerging wonderful resources like that, and the Biophilic Cities network, is to explain how biophilic design is just a part of delivering ecosystem services, which is not just about making life possible, but worth living. It's quality of life, and I think that's a really important point. This is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and you can see there's all the sort of thing, food, fresh water, but other constituents of well-being. We have adequate, feeling well, we have social cohesion and mutual respect. And again, developers and big projects, they often don't see the connection between the green stuff and this. And then we can often, in our various countries, point out that policy often far exceeds practice. And the UK is an example of this, but just looking at it globally a second, I teach at the School of Architecture, and a lot of students never heard of the Stern Report, which shows it's vital to act now to adapt to climate change if we want to save billions of pounds worth of revenue, trillions of dollars worth of revenue. And people haven't heard about it. So it's worth reiterating how all this connects together towards a green urbanism concept. The wonderful Teague report, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, we need to tell people about this, that the smart countries around the world aren't destroying their natural habitats, but recreating and restoring them, because the country as a whole gets wealthier through investment. And Singapore has been mentioned eloquently already. The fact that the Biodiversity Convention included a strategic goal, to enhance benefits to all from biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's the first time that those terms, the ecosystem services, were brought specifically into the link with biodiversity. And very few people were focused on this because sadly the global recession started about the same time. In the UK, we have an ecosystem assessment looking at ecosystem services entitled Understanding Nature's Value to Society. Hardly anyone's read it, very few people know about it, but it's very powerful. And the economics are there in as much as ecosystem services now have to be accounted for in the Treasury accounts. And there's an urban section. This is the urban sub-report of that. And that led on to the white paper published by the current government, which states that a healthy, properly functioning natural environment is the very foundation of sustained economic growth. They're not oppositional, as is often found in many countries, the view, but prospering communities and personal well-being depend upon them. And this is an image from that paper. If that isn't biophilic design, I don't know what is. And it absolutely writes large. Spot the ecosystem services. It's almost like a ladybird book approach. But it's very few people, again, use this in actual development projects and point out that it's government policy. And then we need to sort of try and make the best case we can of economic values in a particular place or a particular project. And what we mean by that is looking through the exposure to high-quality nature down at the bottom left. We go all the way up to the various effects, but they then have economic correlates. If you have increased creativity, that's increased productivity. That's why Google invests so vastly in these sorts of technologies and these sorts of ideas and supports TED Talks, because they get it. They get that this is economy. And we need to make this sophisticated in relation to biodiversity, because biodiversity, which is essentially an indicator and product of the ecosystem or underpins it, is also relates to the ecosystem services you get linearly. Here's a paper from the UK which shows that our psychological benefits increase with the biodiversity content of parallel ecosystems. And this is a paper that I wrote with Ken Yang, which underpins this and says, look, in industry terms and in offices, if an office development with lots of money can do something to restore ecosystems, then the ecosystems can do an awful lot for the profit of those companies. And so this was the first time the British Council of Offices looked at the thing as a sort of a two-way street rather than just what can they do for nature as a sort of charitable sop. And now we are getting into the world of economic valuations. I'm not saying that everything in nature needs economic valuation, but having thought long and hard about this, if this economic valuation can get us where we want to be, frankly, I don't care. We need to do anything we can to stop really bad decisions. And for all the beautiful images from Tim and from Michael, the actual model around the world that is still the norm is urban sprawl with very little of anything we've been shown. And this is a wonderful publication that's worth looking at from the wonderfully named Teresa in Bright Green from New York City, which starts to explore these economic arguments, which need to be at the fingertips of every designer and every ecologist who works for the urban condition. But then I just leave this thought with no further thinking that if you're dealing with a developer who's creating benefits for others, what does he or she get out of it? And I've been working more and more with the idea of marketing. What's the point of innovating if you don't market what you've got? You have to trust the market to understand that what you're selling is better. Then the people building all this can get benefit. Too often I hear, yes, it's very nice, but it's a nice to have. We don't get any money out of it. And that is a really important practical point that needs addressing very carefully by all of us. And we should really, if we can get to the really better clients, start looking at the idea of optimization, saying if they get the idea that all this makes value, then surely there can be better values the more thinking we put into it, some of the beautiful examples we've seen. So, for example, recent conference in London about cogeneration. So you have a living roof here in London with photovoltaics. The living roof benefits from the habitat niche diversity, the photovoltaics benefit from the cooling, and you get higher electrical production. So these sorts of thinkings are win-win. And this project in Imperial College, which we're working with, is the blue-green dream. And this is the idea that if all these things are good, then there's going to be a bit of a push-me-pull-you effect. How do you optimize these these multiple services, whether they be physical, water, air, or indeed biophilic psychological benefits? How do you get the optimum design in a particular system? And then I think we should always point out the obvious. We shouldn't assume that people, especially people running big projects, get it. Kids get it. This is a child who instantly understands nature and wants to be part of it. But for adults, it's very important sometimes to show big physical effects and reveal nature, rather than just assuming that they will get it by a diffuse psychological process. Both are important, but I'm a great one for believing that the more you show, the more the interest is created, especially in a fairly distracted population that has lost a lot of its connection with nature. We also, and a very important point, need to address biophobia. Roger Ulrich, in the wonderful book Biophilia Hypothesis, writes an essay that claims that admitting biophobic responses are hardwired in us in genetics actually underpins a case for making the case for biophilic responses being hardwired. You can't have one without the other, and one actually strengthens the other. We shouldn't run away from it and assume all nature's nice. It isn't. I mean, when I'm working in Singapore or in the tropics and they have attacks from termites or poisonous snakes, it's very hard to sell the product unless you've really got your answers and theory and practice and solutions ready and available. And I can't go on to that further now, but it's something that we do address, and showing things like ecosystem complexity often reduces the number of these pests because it's simplified ecosystems that tends to encourage them. And then we need to show, if we're bringing all this to the city, that we can address conflicts. Buildings, for example, and birds don't get on too well, and it's get too carried away with creating habitats and architecture with nature, and then realizing you've created bird-killing machines isn't a very good idea. So we need to have these answers at our fingertips and be up on the technologies and bring these answers to bear, because otherwise the first time you're not ready with an answer, you'll be shot down. And then the best thing is to work with professionals such as Michael and Tim, who get it, people who don't need convincing, because then we can create exemplars that show the way. This is one little example from the UK, a sports academy with Andrew Wright Associates. You can see the biophilic shapes and forms of this, which works very efficiently for a sports centre. But if you're going to have a climbing wall, why not have it overlooking water? Why not have it with all the sort of E.O. Wilson references so that the benefit from this exercise is much enhanced? And we can increase the impact of local interventions by signposting environment around them. There is something which Urban Place called locational autism. We know, we think we know where we are, but we know nothing about us, around us. So on this building in Scunthorpe, we prescribe the creation of habitats which mimic many of the key habitats in the area in the north of England, which people don't know about because they don't go to anymore. How to create them in detail and then produce them and show them to people so they can say, do you know what, there's a marvelous nature out there and it can be brought to you and you should celebrate where you are in the world. And we can create installations that function with nature with strong reference to past cultural environments that keep the wonderful, to quote Alexander Pope, genius loci, and incorporate biological indicators when we do. One example from London, sorry for all the London references, on the River Thames, old oiling site for Shell oil, big jetty outside for oil, the ships to turn up, but it had a covering in its derelict state of cormorants and herons. Very unusual in this part of London to see so many. And they're all going to be lost because this sort of development has no room for them. So we put in floating hotels, which we built in Germany and brought over, and we installed them, and the birds used them. And I saw a man from Holland. I asked him, why do you think that was done? He says, well, I don't know, but he says, those are fish birds, right? And I said, yeah. He said, well, to me, fish birds means fish in the river means good place to live. And these indicators and the sense of place and time can be done with gestures that are as much artistic as ecological. And we can show how interventions can not only be biophilic and biodiverse, but can have impacts well outside their boundaries. Again, London, Greenwich Peninsula. Here is a derelict peninsula area which had the biggest gasworks in Europe. Instead of leaving the old wall or rebuilding, cut it down, create a terrace, that floods with the tide, that becomes very biodiverse. We explain what all that is doing as an ecosystem, and it becomes the biggest artificial sea bass nursery in the UK. And those fish then go out and become the fish in the North Sea. And we can show the power of multiple biophilic interventions when we start talking scale. I think that's coming up again in the next URBIS webinar. So Stratford, the athletes' village in London, now best new place to live in London, mayors of Water Design Excellence, all that stuff. But the whole point was to try and make it writ large, these sorts of inventions, from living roofs down to ground landscape. So living roofs based on 4 types of UK natural habitats rather than just greening. And then down at ground level, the water filters through wetlands, which people have told me they've set up their shops purely because of this environment there. A final treatment wetland, which itself is a piece of land art, which has many different ecosystems to treat the water and polish it, put it into a final polishing lake, and from there you can flush toilets in a new school at the top of the site and start to close the water cycle loop and make it beautiful. And then we can set targets, and just to finish, we can set targets for nature, because I've thought about this quite a lot, and one of the problems is that engineers and architects are taken seriously and biologists are not in urbanism, generally speaking, when it comes to design teams. And part of that is because we don't take ourselves seriously. If we have the sorts of metrics that Michael was showing his presentation in the Sahara Forest Project, then we can start getting quite good at predicting what's going to happen and sell that and actually use it as a metric, a measure of success. So, for example, in Singapore, an urban site to be redeveloped had this marvelous target by the government of being ecologically designed, not only green, but designed along ecological principles. And so to create the city immersed in the garden, to have water cycle loops and water treatment within the system. These we all helped co-design with landscape architects. But here you see the same landscape seen from a non-humanocentric point of view, from the wider biodiversity, and making specific interventions that make sure that these species turn up. And to do that, you can actually be quite accurate about it. And we came up with an idea of a biodiversity matrix, which is a particular part of the architectural master plan, and against that, where particular species should turn up, when they should turn up, what they needed for their life cycle, and when we would expect them to do so, whether it be flora or fauna. And this is a very useful tool that many architects like, because it starts to show that this is not something that is random and who knows what's going to happen next. It can be predicted to quite a large extent, and the more we work at it, the more likely we are to succeed. The final slide I'll leave you with is a book that we published with Ken Yang and Michael Spector. Michael Pawlyn's got a lovely essay in here, and I co-wrote an essay about these sorts of ideas, especially biodiversity targets. If we want this stuff to happen, then we have to start thinking really seriously about it and not just leave it all to chance. I'll leave it there, and many thanks.
Wonderful, Mike. Thank you very much. And thanks to all 3 panelists. We do have a little bit of time for questions. If people from the audience, if you have a question, please type it in to the screen on your control panel, and we will pitch the questions to our 3 panelists. I'd like to introduce right now the organizer of today, and that is Fleur Timur. She is going to moderate the Q&A. Fleur, thank you very much.
Hello, good morning, afternoon and evening. Thank you ever so much, Tim, Mike and Michael, for some wonderful presentations. There appears to be a lot of answers there in all 3 presentations, and somehow it feels so simple, so uncomplicated and natural to use such solutions to fix what we've done by turning our backs on nature. So I'll go to our first question. So it is predicted that in our developing world, the megacities are mostly going to be in India, Africa and Southeast Asia. All have their own particular human, political and environmental challenges. But how do we get these new cities to embrace the biophilic design and biomimicry design principles, given that we've learned from, well, learning from our mistakes? How do we avoid them just racing for economic growth and making these same mistakes? I will open that up to whoever would like to answer that first. Or I choose. You will have to unmute yourself. I choose Michael Pawlyn to answer this first.
Okay, sure. Well, I think that the best way of getting things moving is with exemplar projects. So one that I quite often use as an example is the example of the Cheongcheon River basin in Seoul, South Korea. So the mayor of South Korea took a very courageous decision to tear down a 10-lane elevated highway and restore the river underneath into an amazing linear park. And I think moves like that really sort of define leadership. It's actually having the courage to do something before there is majority in favor of it, but in the confidence that it will gain majority approval once it's done. And he did actually achieve that. Everyone is delighted with it. It's even improved transport times. And for those of you who are interested in that paradox, it does actually have a name. It's called Brace's paradox, B-R-A-E-S-S, which shows that sometimes when you take infrastructure away, it results in traffic evaporation. And in terms of the sort of human benefits, well, it's a much nicer way of getting around the city. It's reduced temperatures by about 3 degrees in the vicinity, and it's reunited two parts of the city that were previously badly divided by this motorway.
Oh, I have some thoughts.
Thank you, Mike.
I think it's a really important question, because that is going to be the focus, and a lot of what we're doing developing is in the more developed world. And to make it applicable, we have to do, in my opinion, 3 things. First of all, we have to spend time getting pretty acquainted, one way or another, with help or through our own researches, with the culture we're dealing with, and not to assume things are immediately transferable. There are vast differences across culture, despite the fact that biophilia does go fundamentally across cultures and creeds, according to Wilson and Kellett. There is still big differences in filters. And so learning that before we leap into our technologies is really important. And the other thing is inclusivity. In poorer countries, it's a very much more poignant thing that the poor may not get as much out of it as the rich. And development of any kind is seen as a portion only for the few. And the next thing is we need to sort of really attack very, very hard from the outset in project meetings with these clients abroad that it's not a dichotomy of development versus environment, and to prove that through such things as the evidence in the TEEB report, and say that it is about win-win, it is about economics through environment, such as Singapore. And the third thing we can do is take them to wonderful places like Michael just described, take them to see things abroad, take them to see examples, as we've done with people from Malaysia, take them to see it. Is far, far better. Once they see it, they start to get it. So those are the 3 ways I think that we should sensitively approach transfer of ideas and technologies to these developing areas.
Thank you very much, Mike. Tim, do you have...
Well, I was just going to add, I agree with all the comments that have been made so far. For me, I think that I would probably circle back to points of leverage include the concern about resilience and vulnerability to things like sea level rise and climate change and health. The arguments that seem to have the most impact in places like Mexico City have to do with how can that biophilic design help us to solve our air quality, our particulate problem, for example, or water quality. And I think those represent particular points of leverage. But I often do get the question about the economics, to circle back to what Mike is saying, and that really does seem to carry the day with leaders often. I showed that picture of the Park Royal Hotel in Singapore, and it turns out that the day it opened, the hotel was able, this is not necessarily a good thing, but they were able to double their room rate because it was such a hit, and people just really liked the garden and green elements. So I would agree with the things that have been said, though.
Fantastic, thank you. I also have a question from Jared Myers, which was directed at you, Tim, but I'm sure both Mike and Michael will have an opinion too. Is how do you create green networks in dense urban environments? How can we connect the green spaces that are separated by concrete and buildings?
Yeah, I think that we're probably used to seeing the city in a very fragmented way, and certainly our codes are often understanding cities in that way. So we have a green building provision that might incentivize or even mandate a green roof. We often have stormwater management requirements. We tend to see these things to the city in terms of a kind of fragmented elements, and overcoming that is partly a matter of codes, but partly conceptual. So this idea of a whole city, a more holistic notion of the city, understanding it as an ecosystem, I think would really help a great deal when we're planning a park, or we're trying to restore a river, or whatever it is. We need to begin to understand how it contributes to a larger holistic ecosystem. And the codes, I think, are a really interesting thing to ponder. I'm not sure that I have fantastic examples. We have a Biophilic codes initiative, and we're trying to collect codes from cities around the world. But a code that would evaluate and judge a building design or a site design not just by its discrete elements, but rather how it fits in or contributes to ecosystem restoration, biodiversity restoration at a regional or bioregional level. I think that would be an aspiration for me, but we're a long way from that, probably.
Great. Mike or Michael, any response to Jason's question?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. I mean, I know you're yourself a great fan of vegetated architecture. I think the question focuses on density, and as Tim said at the beginning, the challenge of high-density living is how do we make it bearable, and space is a big issue. So there are two challenges. The space available may not be very big, and the management of those resources afterwards becomes a real issue. So I think that looking at vegetated architecture, it's making the argument that it's not just a nice to have, but essentially the only way that you can make the space available in high-density urbanism is to look at vegetated architecture first and foremost as the vital infrastructural link. Yes, we can have pocket parks, yes, we can have smaller spaces and restore rivers, but in really high-density urbanism, there isn't much space for that, and the buildings have to be a focus. And especially things like living walls in street canyons can be phenomenally good ways of dealing with air quality, far better than trees, which can actually block street canyons and block the circulation of air. So again, this issue of an urban landscape being buildings as much as ground level, and not the idea that green architecture is a nice to have, loony fringe thing in the sense of vegetated architecture, but its functionality may be one of the only ways we address this thing in dense urbanism. And the management then thereof needs to become more of a citywide industry that needs government incentives to get it going. Once it's going, costs come down.
Okay, thank you there, Mike. I think that may have answered another question that a panelist sent through about the value of the small spaces when other services are also in demand. The pressure on urban space, available space, is obviously very high, so proving the economic value, sadly we have to, of nature is part of the game. I think we have time for one last question, which is, are there more sort of communication channels and artistic ways to spread the word among the public to create a political momentum, given all the web communications we have and the way momentum picks up very, very quickly nowadays? Does anyone have any ideas about how we can create a political momentum amongst general folk?
For me, the really important thing is getting better at talking positively about what we do want, rather than complaining negatively about what we don't want. And I think that has perhaps been one of the mistakes of the environmental movement, that it's been rather negatively orientated. But it tends to inspire people to action more if you give them a sense of what's possible and how they could bring that about, rather than endlessly talking about how things are getting worse and that's all that is likely to happen. Because it's not that way. It is perfectly possible to have positive initiatives, as Tim and Mike have shown, and I hope I did as well. So that's my main take on it. We need to talk positively.
I totally agree. I think that is there's no other way really. Mike or Tim, do you have any feedback on that question?
Michael.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
No, you go first, Michael, because I'm interested to see what you think.
Well, I was just going to chime in and agree that we've had much more success in talking about the positive visions of the future city. And that can be expressed by showing best practice or visionary renderings, or it often takes a visual element to it. But I find it more compelling to use the biophilic framework now than I do sustainability often, because it has a more positive, forward-looking, this is a future we really want to go towards, rather than trying to emphasize that we need to do this or that, or save this much energy, or reduce that carbon footprint, all things that we need to think about, of course, but we need to paint a positive, compelling picture of a world we want to live in. And I think we haven't been doing a very good job of that, and that's really important, I think.
I couldn't agree more with both Tim and Michael. I just, in terms of getting the message out, one thing occurs to me that I've often wondered about. In the UK, anyway, where I live, there's a TV series called Grand Designs that's very, very, very popular. Everybody watches it, and what it's about is makeovers of houses. People buy a house and turn it into the house of their dreams. I'm sure there's equivalent programs in the States, but this has been it's led by an architect, Kevin MacLeod, and it's grossed enormous viewing figures. There are equally large viewing figures about how to sort out your garden. There isn't a single program on green urbanism. There isn't a single film on it. It's almost as if people in the public think it's too big for me to affect or deal with. And I think it would be wonderful if things like the Biophilic Cities program and the biomimicry and architecture could get a voice that was in the more popular mainstream of TV, film, because it needs to have a place to show how people can collectively or individually contribute to urban areas as a whole rather than their own backyard. It may start with the backyard, but this bigger vision of urban planning and everything, I think it's considered the realm of professionals and slightly dry, and that is, the symptom of that is the lack of television of the issue. And I'd be very interested to hear anybody who had ideas about how we change that.
Good, thank you, Mike. I agree. Although I haven't had a television for some years now, I do remember they do sort of nature programs and things like that. But I agree. Sort of letting people know how simple it is to bring nature back into their urban garden, that they don't have to live in suburbia or rural places to enjoy nature in the city. Well, on that positive note, I hope everybody stays in touch with each other and continues talking and talking positively. And I thank you all very, very much for joining us today, both panelists and audience. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thanks. Cheerio.
Thank you.